Welcome back to What Happened, the show in which I was always going to write an episode about Alan Wake 4, but held off just long enough that Remedy eventually announced a sparkling new remaster that everyone can enjoy. Boy, I can't wait to tackle Rival School soon! Rival School Capcom? Why do I even bother? Anyway, most of you should be familiar with Max Payne, Jack Quantum, and all the slow-mo diving and shoot-banging powers of the greater Remedy-verse. Out of all of their games though, the longest and most ominous shadow fell on Alan Wake, which had an arduous, almost 6-year development cycle fraught with doubt, uncertainty, and a reset of its entire structure. And with that aforementioned remaster out, it's as good a time as any to revisit one of the Finnish company's most unique and important titles. So slip on your tweed jacket, grab your thermos of coffee, and let's shed some light on what happened to Alan Wake.
I'm a writer.
It's 2003 and Remedy Entertainment has just completed Max Payne 2, The Fall of Max Payne, featuring Max Payne. And while it was more of an iterative sequel, they absolutely pushed the envelope in regards to technology. Personally, I remember seeing the physics-based mayhem and going, wow, graphics can't get any better than this. And they never did. Anyway, the studio was riding into high, but after 7 years of wandering the dreary, noir-filled streets of New York, they were looking to do something different for their next venture, and thus spent more than a year dreaming up ideas, settings, and genres. This period of exploration truly ran the gamut and produced some wild stuff that you'd never associate with the studio, given their past or future work for that matter. One such idea was a comedic game that took place within a fantasy world. Think more Terry Pratchett instead of Frank Miller. And while the idea didn't last for very long, one element to its design did: darkness and light. The idea of playing with opposite ends of that spectrum was one of the earliest connective tissues that Remedy latched onto, from the concepting phase all the way to completion. They wanted to focus less on your typical gruff anti-hero like Marky Mark Payne, and more on an everyman, an author in this case, and landed on the name Alan Wake relatively early on. By the start of 2005, they had honed in on the setting, a quaint northwest town named Bright Falls, populated with an eclectic cast of characters and filled with forbidden closets of mysteries. If that feels eerily similar to Twin Peaks, well, that's because it is. Remedy was pretty clear that the seminal 90s dramedy was a huge influence on the game.
This is, excuse me, a damn fine cup of coffee.
There was, however, one major difference in this early version of Alan Wake compared to the game we know today, and that was its structure. In 2005, Bright Falls was going to be an entirely open, free-roaming world that the player could explore. At their peak, Remedy only had 55 full-time employees, which was woefully low compared to what you need to make a sandbox game at that time, and staffing up just to throw bodies at the problem wasn't really Remedy's MO. Thus, the technology team hunkered down for months and months, figuring out how the studio could build a lot of game a lot of quickly. What they came up with was a specific set of engine tools which were built off Max Payne 2's Max Ed level editor, which would allow the team to create vast amounts of game world without having to laboriously place every single bush or tree stump. Former Remedy head Oskari Häkkinen explained, "An unconventional game requires unconventional tools. We spent lots of effort in the early stages of development creating biotypes that mesh together, based off the research photos we took. Now, if we place a road in the middle of the world, for instance, the system automatically knows to put trees or grass on the road. It also automatically generates sprouts of grass coming from the edges of the tarmac and ensures that the grass type is in line with the vegetation surrounding the road. In addition to that, it'll add gravel and a ditch on the sides of the road. The effort put into making these systems work saved us time later, as no post-editing was needed, and they allowed our artists to work very efficiently." Right, the research photos. Finland is very different from the Pacific Northwest, obviously, so the team flew out to Washington State, Oregon, and British Columbia to take over 60,000 photos of diners, lakes, and towns, and even camped out in forests overnight to paint an accurate picture of the region. All of this was done to flesh out the world of Bright Falls, in which Wake could follow the main story path, or he could get into a car and drive to a logging camp, find collectibles, visit restaurants, and avoid eye contact with his fans. It was up to the player, and everything was governed by a dynamic day and night cycle, which of course played into the game's themes. Even at this early stage, the project was looking really impressive, pushing the physics-based systems of Max Payne 2 even further, like logs realistically rolling down a hill. Remedy was feeling confident with what they had and decided to put together a demo for a behind-closed-doors presentation at E3 2005, and this is where the hype machine for Alan Wake slowly started to awaken. The press and potential publishers were all duly impressed, as the game stood out compared to typical open-world fare. It was a dark thriller with a unique hero. It was nestled in forests, lakes, and cabins rarely seen in video games at that point. While several big publishers had shown interest, Remedy went with Microsoft, with one of the chief reasons being that the IP would ultimately belong to them and not the electronics giant, at least not indefinitely, which is why the recent remaster is even possible. Once Daddy Gates' deep pockets were opened up though, Remedy got to work in earnest, building out content, locations, and missions, basically filling Bright Falls with things to do. Slowly though, over the course of 2005, 2006, all the way to 2008, a deep, uncomfortable feeling started welling up in the back of the team's skull. A dark, inky, nagging thing that kept echoing through their collective mind palaces until they could no longer ignore its warning. They had built the game completely wrong. Originally, the day and night cycle pushed two sides of gameplay. During the day, Alan could talk to NPCs, gather clues, and start amassing resources which would be invaluable during the night, where combat would finally kick off. Sam, do the Max Payne face Lake, detailed this process in an interview with Game Informer. When you say night is coming and night brings trouble, it starts to mean the player wants to prepare for nightfall. We had elements where you are driving around in this open world looking for a generator, looking for portable light sources, looking for gasoline for the generator, and then you are setting up a camp and preparing for the nightfall. Also, with the NPCs, we found ourselves in a situation wondering, does it make sense to have NPCs around? This is one of those elements that started to make less and less sense for the team as they built the game's structure and tried to balance its pacing. The main thrust of the story was finding Alan's absconded wife, and when giving the player absolute freedom, that story was robbed of its urgency. When you look at Remedy's history, it's always been clear that story was a driving force for the action. So if they felt that it was starting to slip into the background, well, that's a fair concern, one that Oscari also shared. A thriller is very much like a roller coaster. You need those build-ups to make the plunges feel all the more exhilarating. We just weren't getting this in a sandbox design because all the gamistic things you need were detracting from the story being the focal point. Having flexibility with linear environments also gave us the opportunity to make any given path as wide or as narrow as we pleased. It allowed us to play around with gameplay, narrow stealth areas like when the cops are chasing Wake, and wider areas to allow exploration and that sense of, oh shit, I'm lost, what's in the woods? So yeah, it resulted in a much better game. So while it was a decision that was certainly not made lightly, especially with Microsoft footing the bill, Remedy felt it was the right one for the game. So for the next 2 years, they took a long, hard look at what they had and started to focus. What set pieces and locations worked within the context of the story? What was essential and what was not? They plucked out the areas they had built and started slotting them in like a giant jigsaw puzzle, building each narrative beat one by one, which gave the game a more authored, handcrafted feel. One slight issue though, Remedy, who turned the third-person action genre on its head with Max Payne, was starting to accrue a reputation for super high-quality titles, and a delay to Alan Wake only built up its mystique. Typically, when a game gets delayed over and over, there's this perception it's gonna blow everyone away with innovation or the amount of content or what have you.
This is taking forever.
But at the time, it wasn't really widespread news that the game essentially hit the reset button. What's more is that with it being placed as a big Xbox exclusive during the raging battlefield that was the 7th generation HD Wars, perhaps too much expectation was placed upon Mr. Wake's tweed-covered shoulders.
I don't like it, Al. I don't like any of it. It's not good. In fact, it's the absolute opposite of good.
Eventually, though, as Remedy was piecing together Alan's journey through Bright Falls, a final release date was chosen, May 18th, 2010. Now, while positioned as an Xbox 360 exclusive, a PC version of the game had been confirmed earlier on, which made sense as Remedy had a long history of supporting the format. However, this didn't exactly go to plan, which is something I'll swing back around on in a little bit. Now, while certainly anticipated, the May 18th release date wasn't exactly an ideal situation, because it squarely placed Mr. Wake in the shadow of a number of competitors. I'm not sure if y'all remember, but it was an incredibly busy day for video gaming. On just that specific Tuesday, Remedy had to fend off Prince of Persia: The Forgotten Sands, Split Second, and Red Dead Redemption. In addition to that, less than a week later came Blur, and then Super Mario Galaxy 2, so there were a lot of places gamers could spend their money that week, and unfortunately, Bright Falls wasn't really one of them.
Right. So much for a quiet vacation.
Despite some very positive reviews, Alan Wake reportedly moved only 145,000 copies in its first 2 weeks, while John Marston roped up 1.5 million in the same time frame. Very slowly over the subsequent months, and eventually years, the game inched over the platinum threshold, which, when compared to a lot of other Microsoft-published games of the day, your Gears or your Forzas, wasn't so hot. Alan Wake's American Nightmare, an oddball downloadable spin-off released almost 2 years later, didn't help move the needle much. But what really didn't move the needle much in a lot of gamers, and specifically PC gamers' eyes, was the cancellation of the PC version. Around the game's Xbox 360 launch, Microsoft infamously said, "Some games are more suited for the intimacy of the PC, and others are best played from the couch in front of a larger TV screen. We ultimately realized that the most compelling way to experience Alan Wake was on the Xbox 360 platform, so we focused on making it an Xbox 360 exclusive." Both Microsoft and Remedy have long histories in PC game development. Okay, this decision was about matching the specific game to the right platform. Okay, a ludicrous nonsense statement nowadays, but 11 years ago, it was fairly typical, as lots of console titles saw incredibly delayed PC ports or even skipped them altogether. Remedy, however, fought for the PC for years, finally convincing Microsoft to give the green light, which resulted in the game hitting Steam in 2012, just ahead of Alan Wake's American Nightmare featuring Cody Rhodes. Ever since then, the studio remained tight-lipped about a return to Bright Falls, occasionally dropping hints on how they'd like to revisit it in some fashion, but never going beyond that.
Will we ever get to play Alan Wake 2?
Yes.
Don't give me hope.
It wasn't until Control tied a number of Remedy's franchises together, confirming they all happened in the same universe, which, for a short time, was the most Alan Wake we had gotten in a decade. But hey, the remaster's out now, and look at Alan's face! It actually looks so much better. I'm sorry, I was trying not to bring it up the entire video, even though I love this game. What is wrong with your face? Ah, man, I love dipping into these more positive episodes every so often, but if you know of any other game development life cycles, good or bad, let me know in the comments below, over on my Twitter, or slow-mo dive into the Flophouse VIP Patreon and become a big boss to play a part in what I tackle in the future. Then, at that precise moment, the YouTube content creator influencer, the skeleton guy, then did his sign-off for the fans of his show. See you next time, and thanks for watching!